Okay, so it is my great pleasure to introduce Katie Delph, a rising Morgan senior who has been with the Morgan Pearl team for the past 2 years. So she's had, I think, a pretty unique experience working with myself and Caitlin Ritchie and Abu Bakar and others on this project. She was in it from the get-go on the ground floor, helping us develop a survey of Sika deer hunters. And we did the survey while she was taking classes this past year and had a great response rate. And so Katie, we're grateful that she came back to the Pearl to help with data analysis, report writing, and doing some pretty dang interesting and innovative analyses that she's going to show you here. So without further ado, Katie Delph.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Kanofsky, for that introduction. As you mentioned, I'm Katie Delph. I'm a rising senior at Morgan State University, majoring in biology. And this is my second summer at the Pearl, working on the Sika deer project with the econ team, working under Dr. Kanofsky and Caitlin Ritchie. So it's assessing hunter opinion and economic aspects of Sika deer hunting and management on Maryland's Eastern Shore. So before I get into our research, I just wanted to give a little context and in the importance of recreational hunting at large in Maryland. National surveys do a 5-year approach to gauge participation and expenditures for hunters across the country. So specifically in Maryland, they estimated that 88,000 hunters had spent 1.4 million days hunting in 2011. They had spent over $200 million in these hunted-related expenditures. Of that, over 100 of that million was directed directly into trip-related expenditures, and this generated over $400 million in regional economic impacts that supported over 4,000 jobs, and that generated over $100 million to support those salaries, wages, and business incomes. So from this data, we can see that regional or recreational hunting can have these regional economic impacts that support economies, but national surveys like this at large are broad or too broad to have the scope of research of Sika deer, which is our scope of interest. So a little bit introduction into our Sika deer. Although being named Sika deer is actually a member of the elk family, and it is non-native to North America. It is native to southern Japan, specifically Yukushima Island. And so they were introduced to this area over 100 years ago in the early 1900s when 5 or 6 individuals were released on James Island, which was right off the coast of Dorchester County on Maryland's Eastern Shore. So they prefer the marsh and wetlands areas compared to our native white-tailed deer, which stays in more of the forested, canopied areas. So in the 100 years that it's been established in the Eastern Shore, it's become limited to the Delmarva Peninsula and Maryland's Eastern Shore, because this is one of the only areas in the US that you can free-rangely hunt this species. And so they create this unique recreational hunting experience that has been gaining recent recognition by being featured on Netflix series, certain podcasts, and multiple social media platforms. But despite this, only biological and ecological studies have been published in the literature. So we want to fill those gaps by researching the economic and human dimension studies on the Sika deer hunting experience. So with the research and data that we got from our survey and Maryland's DNR's Hunter Maryland survey, we are able to estimate there are 5,425 Sika deer hunters, both resident and non-resident to Maryland, that had spent over 63,000 days hunting of effort in the 2021-2022 hunting season. And the Maryland Department of Natural Resources was able to estimate that there are 15,000 Sika deer in 2018, and this is the largest free-ranging Sika deer population in the United States. And so with our data, we were able to estimate that 89% of the hunter's effort has been targeted in Dorchester County, their effort in harvest. And the landscape of this county is a little bit more rural and economically challenged. They have the 4th lowest median household income and the 3rd highest poverty rate in all counties in Maryland. So we want to examine if these recreational hunting experiences can benefit their economy. So that brings us to our project goals and objectives. So we wanted to develop and deploy a hunter survey to gather data on their expenditures and how hunters, they form their opinions on the current regulations on Sika deer. And so with that data, we want to be able to estimate the total annual expenditures the Sika deer are accruing and better understand their current opinions on the management of this non-native species, and eventually develop a report for the Maryland DNR with our key findings and any management implications that we can recommend for this non-native species. So it brings me to our survey methods. So we launched our hunter survey at the conclusion of the 2021-2022 hunting season in February. So we developed this survey instrument with the collaboration and funding of the Maryland DNR. We had pre-tested this survey with 10 Maryland hunters to make any revisions to the final draft. Our sample frame was over 96,000 resident and non-resident hunters in Maryland. And as you can see here, this is what they would receive in their email, inviting them to participate in the survey. So it was an online web-based survey that was emailed to hunters that had purchased a license in the past 3 years, and that had provided an email to the DNR during the registration process. And so they had 2 forms of contact soliciting participation into our survey. So the initial email blast and 1 email follow-up 1 week after that initial invitation. So our response rate, as Scott mentioned, we did get a big response rate of over 3,600 viable responses. Unfortunately, we were unable to calculate a formal response rate because there is no specific Sika deer hunting permit. So our hunting sample was all hunters that had provided an email and not just Sika deer hunters. And we were able to gauge Sika deer hunters from the first question of asking if they had ever hunted a Sika deer in Maryland. And if they answered no to that question, they were directed out of the survey. So another integral part of the methods this summer was using Stata, which is a statistical software program. So prior to coming into this internship, I had no experience with any software program. So it was a great experience learning how to write codes and commands to manipulate and visualize the data. That was a key part in our data analysis portion and cleaning up our data set to make it tight and clean. So after our data set was clean and ready for the data analysis portion, we were able to get data from our questions in the survey. These are just screenshots from those questions upon regulation and their estimated trip expenditures. So in the next following slides, I will be examining some of our major conclusions that we received about hunter opinions on regulations, such as antler point restrictions and bag limits, and also explaining our estimations of their total annual spending, the number of public and private hunters, and the amount of trips that they took during the 2021-2022 hunting season. So beginning with antler point restrictions, our survey was able to gauge this by a Likert scale question upon their acceptance and non-acceptance of the current regulations. So currently the regulation on antler point restrictions, there is no minimum antler point to harvest a stag, which a stag is a antlered Sika deer. So we were able to get data upon 44% of hunters found the status quo to be acceptable upon the status quo, which is the current regulation for Sika deer. But interestingly enough, when we examined and brought into the equation the alternate 1, which is a minimum point or a minimum of 2 points to be able to harvest a stag, increase of 52% of hunters found this to be acceptable. So it's an interesting observation that hunters are more accepting to a change in this regulation. But that regulation would only tolerate to a certain amount, because when we had a third alternative to a 3-point minimum to harvest a stag, a whopping 83% of hunters found this to be unacceptable in a change of regulation. And in terms of bag limit, we had a similar approach to this Likert scale acceptance. So the current status quo for the harvest and bag limit of stags is you can harvest 3 stags in the total season upon all 3 weapon seasons. So we found that 49% of hunters found the current status quo to be acceptable, but also interestingly, similar to the antler point restrictions, we found that a 10% increase to 59% of hunters accepted a change in bag limit to a decrease of 2 stags to be harvested in the given hunting season. So this is an interesting opportunity for wildlife managers to be able to make a change for the better and enhance the hunter's experience upon regulations. So secondly, of our results, we were able to estimate annual trip expenditures. So we were able to estimate that hunters spent 11.6 million in total annual spending. 7.7 of this was private land hunters and 3.9 million was public land hunters. We also explored a 95% trimmed mean, which reduced this total spending by about 15%. In our survey, we were also able to ask about the allocation of this spending, and the majority of hunters indicated that 75% or more of their expenditures occurred in the county that they hunted in. We also able to estimate that about 2,800 public land hunters took over 10,000 trips, and 3,400 private land hunters took over 15,000 trips. So a little bit of discussion from our results. So we were able to understand that hunters are accepting of new regulations compared to the status quo. So this is an opportunity for the wildlife hunters to make a change in the regulation to again enhance the hunter's experience and also the ecological stability of this non-native species. We were also able to understand that of this over $10 million that they're spending in trip expenditures, most of that is staying in these counties. So it has potential for economic significance for these counties that are a little bit more financially disadvantaged and to support their economy and local businesses. And like I had mentioned, is one of the only places in the US that you can hunt this animal free range. So it is a source of tourism that also brings in new revenue for the economies on the Eastern Shore. We were also able to understand that private land and archery had the highest expenditures. So private land, usually a lot of outfitters and guide services use private land. So they charge a fee. So that is a driving force that increases these expenditures. And also archery season is by far the longest season. So hunters are spending more days and spending more money in their effort in archery season. So with our research, we were able to understand that Sika deer hunting does have economic significance that can support these economies, and we can implement or provide recommendations for the wildlife managers upon regulation. So I just want to thank the Pearl for hosting this internship, specifically my mentors, Dr. Scott Kanagi and Caitlin Ritchie, for all their guidance and support over the past 2 summers. Dr. Knobloch, the coordinator of our internship, for making this all possible. I want to thank the Maryland DNR for their funding and specifically their game mammal section leader, Brian Eiler, for help with the data. The Chesapeake Research Consortium and Randy Rao for hosting me as a C-Stream intern. And last but not least, the Sika deer, because without them, we would have no research project for me to work on. So I just want to give a big thanks and shout out, and also to the fellow interns for all their support this summer. Yes, sir. Oh.
Are there any considerations of changing the regulations on the Sika deer limits or bag limits or antler size?
Well, currently we're in the stages of developing the report with our findings to submit to the DNR. So that's upon their review and their discretion to change the regulations. But once we get that data, I'm sure that there'll be some talk of revising any regulations or talk of regulation revision. Yeah.
Sure. Why do you think that hunters were more in favor of a decrease?
I would think that the hunters that are more in favor of that are thinking more long-term about the future of this hunting experience, especially with the antler point restrictions, that maybe different hunters have different motivations. And if they're more of a trophy hunter and they want stags with larger antlers, they would want the young stags to be able to develop and not all the other hunters be able to harvest those deer. So giving a chance for them to develop and future opportunities for hunting. Yes, sir.
As a rising senior, how might you see the new acquired skills in programming and data analysis work for you in the future?
Yeah, I definitely had a struggle learning Stata, and it was an awesome experience to be able to learn that. Like I said, I had no prior knowledge, so I think it'll be a great tool that I can bring back to Morgan State and apply to any of my upcoming studies or different classes I could take to implement my statistical analysis programming skills.
Got 3 Zoom questions. Do you feel it would feel it more hunters to have tighter, more solid regulations, or to loosen up these regulations and leaving more other?
Well, upon our data and estimating these changes in regulations, it does seem that hunters have a stronger acceptance for more stricter regulations. And as I mentioned, it could be, you know, a future generational thing to sustain this species. So I think that hunters are receptive to changes in regulation.
Given that Sika deer are non-native, what are the goals of DNR? Do they want to maintain or eliminate the population?
Upon research, they want to maintain its cultural carrying capacity so that it's not harming the native species here or the native environment. And so their populations aren't exploding, but they don't want to necessarily eradicate this non-native species.
So local governments and even at the national level must have serious education and public service programs and announcements that seriously address the tragic problem. This is there actually. It will take time, but I think. All right. So that is all of our questions for Katie, I believe.
Yeah, sure.
Has there been any observation of a decline or increase in cedar population in the last, say, 20, 30 years? I've been hunting for about 40 years and I have 85 acres of land in South Georgia. So I'm intimately familiar with the cedar and the hunt. So I'm quite interested in this.
Yeah, well, the last estimation that I mentioned is in 2018, 15,000 individuals. And I think that the 100 years that it's been here, their population has been steadily increasing. So I'm not sure what the current data is on their current population, and that's just an estimate, but I do think that their population is growing. Yes.
Yeah, can you go back to extension slide? It was hard to hear that grass cutting activity, but I hear you did something looking at 95%. What is there?
Yeah, so we also explored a 95% trimmed mean. So that was accounting for any outliers. So survey respondents that had either extremely high or extremely low estimates. So this just gave us some more conservative estimate of total expenditure. So that reduced it by about 15%.